Candice Morey is our speaker today, and I'm not going to waste much of her time other than to tell you that she's come to us from Edinburgh, University of Edinburgh, where she's currently a Chancellor's Fellow, working, is it philosophy and psychology and language and business, yes. And
no, not the rest, just philosophy, psychology and language.
So she's been there since 2013. Prior to that, she was in the University of Groningen as a Rosalind Franklin Fellow. Before that, you were another kind of fellow in Washington University.
Yes.
And before that, you were doing your PhD in Missouri with Nelson Cowan, who anyone who does stuff on working memory will know is quite a dignitary. And that abilities of information working memory, of developmental trajectories in working memory from childhood all the way through to adulthood. And today she's going to talk to us about some of that work, looking at the role of eye movements in memory for visual information. Candice, thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. That was very nice. Right, I'll get right into it because I know that we're on a time limit. So I'm interested, for the purpose of these talks, in thinking about action in the service of memory. And in most models of working memory, certainly in the most popular ones that you're likely to be familiar with, I'll only review very briefly, these models delineate collections of processes that support real-time memory. And some of the processes that are believed to support real-time memory are linked with actions. The main thing that will pop to mind here is rote rehearsal. So rote rehearsal, and in many models, there's a specific module devoted to the idea that this kind of rehearsal will be carried out. That's for doing this kind of rehearsal and for nothing else. And I'm saying in scare quotes that everybody knows how it works. Everybody knows how verbal rehearsal works. Everybody knows that there's a special module for it. I put that in quotes because I don't know that that's necessarily true. But there are a few things that people widely tend to believe about verbal rehearsal, and I want to briefly go through those. So, rehearsal should be helpful. Repeating information in mind that you're trying to remember for some later test should actually help you perform better on the later test compared to a circumstance when you're not doing this. Rehearsal should also be strategic. The participant engages in on purpose for the purpose of improving their memory. It's believed to require effort to initiate a rehearsal sequence as part of the strategic decision process. Deciding which of the information you're going to rehearse requires effort. However, once this cycle is initiated, and once this cycle has perpetuated a time or two, it shouldn't cost effort anymore. And that's one reason that people think that it's so beneficial for memory. This is something that you can have going on in the background. Once this is initiated, it doesn't cost you any further effort. You're likely to remember more because of it without it costing too much past this initial investment. So this is rehearsal according to verbal memory research. Some models of working memory, particularly the most popular spatial locations, or what some image looks like. And as you'll see in this model, the rehearsal that everyone knows about, that everyone knows how it works, the inner speech that perpetuates verbal information and helps it maintain active in some phonological store. This is something that they think they've developed very, very highly. And rather by analogy, since some information is held in a verbal store and we can also hold visual information, it was decided that there should be some parallel visual system, including some visual store and also some visual rehearsal mechanism. But since everyone knows how verbal memory works, and everyone assumes that this is through doing speech repetitively, and this is going to have something to do with all the mechanisms involved in speech, since I only want to focus on these kind of functions today, visual memory storage, and what sort of processes might be going on to support visual memory storage. Visual-spatial rehearsal is demanded by the multi-component model of working memory, some way of keeping visual information active. And what processes are supposed to be used for this? One candidate is motor-based rehearsal based on eye movements. So, for instance, if you're trying to remember some sequence of spatial locations, you would remember this in part by remembering the movements that your eyes make as the sequences appear around the computer screen or around whatever setting you're trying to remember information from. So, could this work? Well, there's a lot of reason to think that there's some benefit to looking at nothing, looking back at nothing. Activating speech through the action of moving your mouth and throat muscles in the same way that you would do when you speak. Something like this could be thought to support serial spatial memory, and there's already some evidence that this is the case, that making eye movements similar to the ones that you made during encoding have some benefit for retrieval. But it is difficult to see how this could support memory for imagery, how eye movements to specific locations and the memory of what muscles you used and how you used them in order to make those eye movements could help you remember what object was in a particular location, or precisely what color that object was. However, it's also thought that looking back to a place where something was facilitates retrieval of visual representations. Fernanda Ferreira outlined what someone said who has just left the room. There's a tendency to look back to where that person was sitting, even though they're not there, and you're not going to get any stimulus information from doing that. However, looking back at that person might actually make you remember what it was that they said that you're trying to come back up with. Similarly, I think everybody will laugh about all the times they wandered into some room knowing that there was something that they needed to do there or get there. They can't remember, and the way to try to reactivate this memory is to leave to go back to the place where you started the sequence in the first place. So maybe looking back at the places where the thing you're trying to remember was does something to facilitate retrieval. Maybe it serves as some kind of nothing, using motor sequences from eye movements that help trigger visual memories. I also think it's quite possible that there is nothing in vision analogous to speech processes that enable verbal rehearsal. So the bulk of my research activity has been in replicating dual task memory studies, in which I ask people to remember something while asking them to do something else. Classic sort of studies that Baddeley and his group have been doing for decades. But I tried to turn these so that we're not talking about verbal memories, but we're talking about visual memories. I want to see whether everything that can be said about how you remember verbal information applied to vision works the same way or not, whether the verbal information is privileged in a way that visual information is not. And one reason that this could be is because there are ways to instantiate verbal information using speech that just don't exist for vision or aren't particularly effective for vision. Why do I say this? So we know already that memory for visual materials is consistently poorer than memory for verbal materials. When you're even talking about verbal information presented orally or visually, there's consistently a modality effect. If you present this information orally, you're going to get better performance out of participants than if you present it visually. If you look instead and compare verbal information, whether presented oral or visually, to visual information, sequences of spatial locations, or memory for poorer than their memory for verbal information. Another reason that I think that visual information cannot be stored in the same manner that verbal information is, and we shouldn't be assuming theoretical mechanisms that are identical, is that we know that visual memoranda are far more susceptible to interference than verbal memoranda are. We know this a lot from work that I've done. So if you ask participants to remember something like an abstract visual display, even if it only contains a little bit of information, maybe 2 colors that they need to remember, and then you ask them to do literally anything else during a retention interval of a few seconds, memory is going to get worse for that visual information, no matter how little of it there is, and no matter how different the interpolated task we have, the retention interval of a few seconds, performance is worse compared to when they don't have to do this tone task in the interval. I don't want to give the impression, though, that this is only my research that shows this, even though a lot of other researchers have done very similar things, asked people to remember some visual information, made them do something else with the interpolated interval, and interpreted their results such that it meant that visual information was fairly impervious to interference from non-visual sources. That isn't actually true. So I've been working on a meta-analysis in which I have been collecting as much data as I can archivally, looking for studies going back since the time that the visual storage module was proposed by Baddeley and his colleagues. And had participants do something, anything, in between the time when they were given this visual information to remember and the time when they were tested. And I've found about between 700 and 800 instances of this. These aren't separate papers necessarily, but there's single experimental comparisons within one paper. And I coded whether the interpolated task was mainly auditory, like judging tones or having to recognize bird calls, was mainly verbal, regardless of whether it was orally or visually presented, so having to read off words, having to remember words, having to remember lists of digits, even having to do arithmetic.
Sorry.
Or whether the task was mainly visual. Or whether the task was mainly visual, having to do with judging some kind of visual sequence, judging some kind of color, anything that I judged wouldn't be is an estimate of the effect size. I'm using Hedges G for this. The effect size between a condition where there was no interpolated task and a condition where there was one of these categories of interpolated tasks. And so if it's the case that there is some visual memory stored specifically for holding visual information, and rehearsing or processing other visual information will selectively interfere with it, you would expect to see that on an average across lots of studies, there's going to be a bigger effect size of interpolating a visual task on a visual memory, a visual processing task with visual memory, than any other kind of task with visual memory. But this is clearly not the case. If the task is verbal, you see the same kind of effect size. Even if the task is auditory and has nothing to do with seeing anything, you still see a quite respectable average effect size approaching 1 on this measure. Process akin to verbal rehearsal or visual information. So, I'm going to show you some data from 3 different studies. One of them, the first one that I'm going to show you, is an ongoing study, a developmental study that I've been working on. And these are, I'm going to go over a range. What I'm trying to do these days is to figure out a few things. I want to know how closely gazes measured during the retention interval of some memory task correspond to the to-be-remembered information. So I've used spatial memory tasks where I think that it's much more likely that that link is going to be related to what they end up recalling than with visual imagery tasks. But I've also tried visual imagery tasks, for instance, remembering the pattern of some colors on the screen. And I'm looking to see whether consistent sequential looking during a retention interval when there's nothing to be remembered on screen benefits recall, or whether the task was mainly visual, having to do with judging some kind of visual sequence, judging some kind of color, anything that I judged wouldn't be really verbalizable and that even usually the researchers were saying was a visual task. Each point on each of these violin plots is an estimate of the effect size. I'm using Hedges G for this. The effect size between a condition where there was no interpolated task and a condition where they're specifically for holding visual information, and rehearsing or processing other visual information will selectively interfere with it. You would expect to see that on an average across lots of studies, there's going to be a bigger effect size of interpolating a visual task on a visual memory, a visual processing task with visual memory, than any other kind of task with visual memory. But this is clearly not the case. If the task is verbal, you see the same kind of effect size. Even if the task is auditory and has nothing to do with seeing anything, you still see a quite respectable average effect size approaching 1 on this measure. So all kinds of stimuli interfere with visual memory. And in my thinking, this could be because there's not much of a way to keep visual information active in the short term and prevent anything from interfering with it. There's, in other words, no sort of process akin to verbal rehearsal or visual information. I'm going to go over a range. What I'm trying to do these days is to figure out a few things. I want to know how closely gazes measured during the retention interval of some memory task correspond to the to-be-remembered information. So I've used spatial memory tasks where I think that it's much more likely that you'll be able to see a link between what people are looking at and the order in which they look at it during retention and what was presented. And it's much more likely that that link is going to be related to what they end up recalling than with visual imagery tasks. But I've also tried visual imagery tasks, for instance, remembering the pattern of some colors. With the color memory tasks, whether fixating the former locations of objects during retention when the to-be-remembered information is no longer there improves recognition memory performance. So that's sort of the first bar for assuming that eye movements can be used as some kind of rehearsal mechanism. But just finding a link between accuracy and where people are looking, I don't think is enough to call what people are doing rehearsal, because rehearsal also involves choosing to engage in this activity. It should be strategic, and it should follow certain patterns. So if there are benefits in looking back to something a few ways. First, I'll try to find out whether eye movements can be linked to strategic choices. I'll also consider developmental trajectories, testing children of various ages, and the data I'll show you today come from a sample of children between 5 and 7 years old, where I'll look to see if they likewise show benefits of congruent gaze sequences during retention and ultimate recall. The reason that this age group of children is so important is because it's widely believed that children under 7 years old don't systematically rehearse even verbal information. Which is somewhat controversial. It may be the case that they do, but what isn't controversial is that their ability. And also, I'll check to see whether there's evidence of selective attention where there should be. If it's the case that looking is a mechanism of rehearsal in visual memory, then you should be selecting relevant things to rehearse, not selecting irrelevant things to rehearse. So let me start with a spatial order reconstruction task. And what my students and I have done here is quite similar to a study that Sébastien Tremblay and his colleagues published in 2006. The participants are doing spatial serial reconstruction. And so their stimuli is always a picture of a puppy, because we're testing little children. And the puppy moves around the screen to list length positions. This varies depending on what age group we're working in. And the participants are told that what they should do, there's a dog walker walking this puppy, and the puppy gets loose, and so they need to watch where the puppy goes so they can then outline where each puppy was. And these outlines give participants something to look at. We then measure where they look sequentially during this 8,500 milliseconds. Adults saw 7 locations, and the young children saw 4 locations. And we tracked their eye movements during both presentation and the retention interval. What we've done to build on what Tremblay and colleagues have already done, so I'll give this away, they have shown that there's a relationship between what people look at and the sequence of things that they look at during this 85 millisecond retention interval and ultimately their serial recall scores. In addition to adding the developmental data to this, we have added a new method of comparing the similarity between what participants are meant to remember and what they look at during the response to pictures. They've taken it in turn from genetics analyses. And the basic idea is that you've got 8,500 milliseconds in our case of gaze data. It's undirected gaze data. We're not telling the participants what to do. They just look at whatever they feel like looking at. Suppose the puppy appears in positions 1, 2, 3, and 4. Over this 8,500 millisecond retention interval, the fixations occur perhaps many, many fixations. There's usually going to be more than 4. There could be something like 30. The fixations occur to positions 1, then 1 again, then position 2, then position 1 again, then position 3, then 2, then 4, plus various irrelevant positions in between them with nothing in them at all. Remembered position 2. Right, we count that as 1 pair rehearsed. Did they ever go from 2 to 3? Okay, if they did, we count that as 1 pair rehearsed. If I apply that logic to this sequence, you end up with only 1 pair, which might actually underestimate the amount of useful information that participants' eye movements are giving them about what the sequence actually was. It also might overestimate it. I'm not sure actually which to predict, because it could be the case that this looking from 1 to 2 was entirely incidental. There's only a few things to look at on the screen. So they might have drastically underestimated the amount of eye movement rehearsal going on, or even overestimated it. What longest common subsequence does to help with this is that it ignores any refixations, so it ignores things. Do we see 1, 2, 3, and 4 in that order anywhere, forgetting that there's stuff in between them? And in this case we do, so we would count this sequence as a fully rehearsed sequence of the entire 4-item string. these are our behavioral data. So in developmental research, especially when we're not looking for performance differences between participants, we're looking at differences between the relationship between their gazes and performance. It's really nice if you can equate performance across groups, and I think we did that beautifully. So here are the 5 to 7-year-old children with their 4-item list lengths. You see a nice serial position curve. Here are the young adults with their 7-item list lengths, also quite a typical serial position curve. And the distribution of the longest common subsequences between gazes during retention and the to-be-remembered list. And I've broken this up by gazes during the presentation itself and during the retention interval, because I wanted a sanity check. During the presentation, participants should be looking at the items as they appear on the screen, and so these common subsequences should be really high. They should be looking at each one. I mainly wanted to do this for the sake of the 5 to 7-year-old children, because children that age are hard to keep on task, and I wanted to make sure that we weren't including a lot of trials in which we knew the participants weren't even looking at the screen or doing anything during this task. And I was then quite surprised to see that actually the young children, you see this blue density function here is right. These kids were almost always looking at everything that we showed them during presentation. Not necessarily during retention, but again, that's, I think, no surprise. Adults, on the other hand, were not looking at everything precisely during presentation. They were likely to directly fixate 6 or 7 of the items as 2, 3, 4, basically any number of the items. This is also not a really big surprise during presentation. Elke Long and some of her colleagues have analyzed eye movements of adult participants during a spatial serial reconstruction task like this one, and found that adults actually don't necessarily fixate each individual item. They make saccades from the first item around towards where the other items are occurring. So adults and children seem to be engaging with this task somewhat differently despite their similar performance. It's really, really well. Again, the blue is the presentation, during the presentation, the red is during retention, and the dependent variable is the longest common subsequence between the gazes during those periods and the to-be-remembered response, the correct response. And I've plotted them on the x-axis by whether the participants report the list correctly or whether they report them incorrectly. So for adults, I tend to ignore the blue I not, but during retention, the adults they have a longest common subsequence between where they look at retention and what the correct response is when they ultimately give the correct answer compared to when they give the incorrect answer by something like half an item, which is not a trivial amount in visual memory research. If children were not rehearsing, then we would not necessarily expect to see the same relationship between their longest common subsequence and the correct response during retention. But we actually, with these data, can't yet rule that out. So all the analyses I'm going to report today have base factors attached to them. I'll tell you the odds for some difference or for some interaction in the data. And the evidence for an effective accuracy, for an effect of whether they ultimately respect children and adults into the same model. We also don't see a significant interaction between the children and the adults' responses and gazes. However, it's not convincing yet. The evidence against the interaction is approximately 3. We only have 17 young children at this point. So I'm not convinced that this difference is really the same as this difference. However, oh yes, and if you just look at this difference in children, the evidence that this value is higher than this value is marginal. But we can't rule it out, and more data could actually turn this one way or the other. Another thing that we looked at in these data to further assess whether participants are intentionally engaging in any kind of rehearsal process that has anything to do with presentation, are they looking back at previous items as the sequence is progressing? In the model of verbal rehearsal that everyone knows about is that you hear some digit, say, if you're listening to a digit list, then you hear a second digit, and what you do in your mind then is repeat the 2 in order, and then you hear a third, and then you repeat all 3 in order, and so on and so forth until you don't have time to repeat them all anymore. So if maybe participants are doing something like this with their eye movements, and we do see, this is presentation order on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, the mean number of times each item was fixated across a number of trials. we see that they are more likely to go back and look at where the first item was than anything else. Early items are more likely to be refixated than late items, and this was overwhelmingly the case. Phase factor against this effect was already about 9. So, and also, there was no differential effect between adults' accuracy and children's. It looks sort of like maybe for adults, it's the correct are more linear than the incorrect, but the model is against this, an interaction between this and this by a factor of more than 40. So even with this amount of data, I think that's already convincing enough to say it's not there. So far, eye movement-based spatial rehearsal, the most plausible of the accounts so far, I think. We do find, like Tremblay found, that looking during retention provides an accuracy. These phenomena don't necessarily look like rehearsal should look. Children look proportionally at longer sequences than adults did. Their longest common subsequences were nearly at ceiling, between 3 and 4 items, where 4 was the number of items that they were given, whereas adults were also between 3 and 4 items, about half the number of items that they were given. If children are not rehearsing and adults are, that's not the pattern that you would expect to see. It should be reversed. Refixating isn't linked to overall accuracy, so even if there's something that looks kind of like rehearsal going on, it's not helping, and that's one of the points of rehearsal. Rehearsal is supposed to help. This is an ongoing project. There are more analyses planned, but at the moment, eye movements look like they're helping, but it doesn't look like they're back at something is a strategic thing that people do in order to try to remember information about it. These data were collected while I was at Groningen, my PhD student Jonathan Mall, and 2 of our research assistants there. So what we did, this experiment was designed to test hypotheses about dividing attention across objects in participants varying on complex span task performance. And in the working memory literature, complex span tasks, gold standard of figuring out how much information one person can remember at once. In these kinds of tasks, give participants something to remember. It can be anything. It can be a word, a number, a spatial location, whatever you like. And then you give them some processing decision to make. You repeat this sequence as many times as you know so that you've got some measure of how much they can hold if they can't do any kind of rehearsal. Outcomes on complex span tasks have been correlated with academic performance. They've been correlated with reasoning scores on intelligence tests. They've been correlated with all sorts of useful things, also various attention things. So being able to better inhibit looking at irrelevance flash on the screen, for instance. Stroop task performance is another. And so what we wanted to see, we wanted to take people who we had scores on these sorts of tasks for, choose the people who were performing in the highest quartile, for people who were performing in the lowest quartile, and also some people in the middle, and measure their performance on triangles, but they were just told to try to remember all of them. You'll be tested on any one of them. So with no bias introduced to what they should be attending to. In other blocks of trials, the same participants were told, right, you need to pay attention to only the circles. You'll only be tested on the circles. In other blocks of trials, the same participants were told, the circles are more important. You're more likely to be tested on a circle than you are to be tested on a triangle. Of course, we counterbalanced which shape participants were biased for. On these trials where there was some bias, if they were biased 75% towards the circles, then there would 75% of the time be a test of the circles. Usually in a task like this, 8 items is too much for participants to remember. We wouldn't expect performance. It should range from something like 55% correct to 75. In these analyses I'll show you 58 participants that also had valid gaze data, which we measured during the retention interval mainly. And these participants ranged across the entire spectrum of working memory span scores. And then we recruited them based on whether they were in the lowest, the middle 2, or the highest quartile. And so what this shows, I'm going to focus on accuracy in the divided attention condition. This paper is published though, so if you're interested, you can look up and see the accuracy in the other conditions as well. So whether people with high and low scores on complex span tasks were more likely to be able to focus attention on the things that would matter. As it happens, the low span participants were more likely to ignore the frequent shape and focus on the predominant shape, as measured by the difference in their performance between tests on the predominant shape and tests on the infrequent shape. The higher capacity subjects, the smaller difference between performance on the predominant shape and performance on the infrequent shape. Possibly our interpretation of this, which is borne out in a follow-up experiment, is that the high span individuals just believe they can remember everything. So this accuracy here, really strongly, with an R of 0.41 and a base factor on that R of more than 37. So the high span individuals also looked at the rarer items oftener. And I've plotted here looking at both the presentation while the colors were on the screen and during the retention interval where the colors weren't there. So this is what really matters for hypotheses about rehearsal, because they're looking back at something that they're trying to remember. And here the relationship is much stronger. So performance is correlating 0.5 between their working memory capacity score, which is done completely differently from this visual change detection task, and so affected their recognition accuracy in the change detection task. If they looked at the infrequent shape that was eventually tested, or sorry, if they looked at any of the shapes that was eventually tested, their accuracy was 0.88. If they did not look at the shape that was eventually tested, their accuracy was only 0.75, which was a statistically significant difference. So, looking may reflect retrieval attempts. What we learned from this is that fixations that occurred during retention improved recall, were consistent with attention allocation evidence. So there could be some possible chain of events where information is encoded, it's based in part on identifying object locations, and then looking towards some previously occupied location facilitates retrieval. I'm debating, I think yes, I will try to extend participants' attention by biasing tests to particular shapes, getting them to look around a lot. In the next study, the last study I want to tell you about, we didn't do this. We allowed completely free looking, and we wanted to see whether we could, under these conditions, observe relationships between looking and performance, particularly when we allow something like perceptual grouping to happen. So in this version of visual change detection task, what we did was we manipulated whether a visual array including some number of colors included a repeated color or even two repeated colors, or whether it included all unique colors. Now when you repeat a color in a display like this, performance gets better, but interestingly it gets that there's something else going on that's making these things very salient and helping participants to remember them. We recorded eye movements during the retention interval and during the stimulus presentation. And let's see, I will not really talk about the color sharing effects that much, except what I need to. So we did replicate these perceptual grouping effects. This shows our conditions in which there were only uniquely colored items. These are hierarchically determined capacity estimates using a model referred to as Wombat. These are capacity estimates when the repeated color is tested, and these are capacity estimates when the unique color is tested when there's in the presence of repetitions. And it was this that turned out to be particularly interesting in the looking data. I'm going to skip that. Okay. So participants don't dwell on these repetitions, not at stimulus presentation or at retention. So during the retention interval, what we find, I'll focus on that since that's what's more important, participants are actually more likely to seek out one of the unique items. In each of these plots, the blue bar is the point at chance, which we would expect them to be looking at one of the repeated items, and that varies by set size. And especially at the low set sizes, what we always see are participants seeking out the unique items to look at. They're much more likely to be looking at them. However, we replicated this, asking participants to devote attention and test, and also this advantage for this capacity boost for the unique items, which is the ones they were selectively seeking out, now goes away and is no longer present in the data. Also note that these capacity estimates are way lower than capacity estimates without backwards counting, indicating once again that basically everything interferes with visual memory. So to wrap up, I'll summarize all this evidence. Data are consistent with the idea that sequential eye movements provide some information that's helpful for recovering visual and spatial information. And we see that data are consistent with the idea that gaze corresponds. This effect varies a lot across studies, assuming that fixations reflect retrieval attempts. This isn't that surprising though, because accuracy effects might be muddied a bit by unsuccessful retrieval attempts. However, it's difficult to link these relationships between gaze and recall to a modular visual-spatial rehearsal mechanism because, one, children under 7 believed to be developing rehearsal strategies look about as likely to benefit from this as adults are who should have these capabilities. Strategic looking seems to occur, but beneficial effects are removed by a non-visual secondary task, which, if it is specific to the visual modality. So none of this and none of the evidence that we have points to rehearsal developing and continuing automatically, at least not yet. So this evidence in total is more consistent with a scenario in which control of eye movements requires general processes, not one in which there's a specific visual rehearsal mechanism that's motivated by eye movements. And so with that, I want to thank my colleagues, several undergraduate students who are instrumental in helping with this data collection, some postgraduate students, and various other sources. Thanks very much.
Afterwards, so people can come along and talk to Candice afterwards if they don't have time to ask or talk about what they want to now. But having said that, we have a few minutes. So are there any questions in the room before we go to the universe?
Or on Periscope.
What?
I'm inviting people who are here with us virtually to ask a question.
Ulrich, you're first in the queue.
Some of your results, and also when I go back to this summary of the interference studies you gave in the earliest slides, reminded me of a very old-fashioned theory with Glanzer and Clark about the verbal loop. And the basic, I'm not sure whether that's the popular, where the basic idea is that whatever gets into this visual short-term store, whatever it also creates some sort of verbal.
I'm not familiar with the source that you raised, but so it is I think it's uncontroversial that people will attempt to verbally recode visual information. But we do our best to make sure that that verbal code would not help them do things like present stimuli so quickly that they couldn't possibly verbally recode all of it. They couldn't remember that the green triangle was at 9 o'clock and the orange triangle was at 2 o'clock or something like that because the presentation is so quick. Another thing that I find very interesting about that theory, and I talk with my colleagues who I disagree with about this all of the time, is if there is a verbal rehearsal loop for verbal things and a visual rehearsal loop for visual things, that's, I think, a puzzle of the multi-component working memory model that nobody has really answered very well yet. Why in the world you would have to prevent verbal recoding if you've got this rich visual system for encoding information?
More questions?
Yes.
Are you interested at all in how, like, I guess, like with language, so rather than it being like a verb, auditory loop, being like so looking at words and how people process reading, like presumably they would read that as well.
From my understanding, not to correct me if I'm wrong, that people who are into studying language do not believe at all in the verbal rehearsal loop model. Is that more or less your impression, or?
I'm not really sure. I was just interested in, I don't know that much about that.
If it's purely about remembering clusters of sounds in a loop that's meant to automatically extract these sounds, then you wouldn't expect for linguistic content to make the big difference that it does.
Sort of a parallel idea to the one you talked about is the idea that covert attention shifts underlie methods and visual-spatial phenomena. And often people make the distinction that though I don't have to move my eyes to attend somewhere, if I do move my eyes to a location, then my covert attention will surely perceive it. I wonder to what extent some of the data in this area suggests that it's not necessarily that.
Definitely something to think about when, especially when we see the pattern of things that adults look at when the stimuli are actually on the screen. The idea that they're covertly attending to these items rather than overtly attending to these items is the most obvious way to explain why they aren't directly fixating the items that appear on the screen. And it's true, if they don't need to directly fixate the items to encode them, then you wouldn't necessarily expect them to look back to each position in order to reactivate this information. Now, I think it's still the case that we can use the overt eye movements to have some view on this, because measuring their covert attention is going to be much more difficult. But the effects that we find in visual array tasks, looking back at items, if they were tested on an item that they looked back on, they would be anywhere from, I wasn't able to show you all the data on this, but 12% better on recognition, but I've seen it as low as 4% better. And so I definitely think it's not the case that the only way to reactivate this information is to look back at this. Yes.
If you tell people to rehearse it with their eye movements, are they better at the task?
That I don't know. So I'm actually collecting some data about this right now. I don't like to actually tell them to do it.
You can instruct them in some way, or basically the idea is to manipulate it so that they do.
So certainly that's right up my, is that we're showing them some sequence of items, and then during the retention interval, we're going to either flash up the same sequence again, and in this particular task, it's not the locations themselves that need to be remembered, but the items in the location. So flashing the locations in the correct order during retention, it's just a way to make sure that they actually do look at least part of the sequence again. We're comparing this to just flashing up the central location, where the participants then are going to be looking at the center of the screen most of the time, and flashing up a random sequence of locations, where we've messed up any link between what their eyes are doing and the original sequence that they saw. And so far, so these data are in collection. Another reason that I'm not too sure that the eye movements are that good a proxy for rehearsal is if you don't make them, performance is better than
if you were to do the analog with verbal stimuli.
I guess the analog with verbal stimuli would be, it doesn't compare very well at all, I guess, because that would be repetitive articulatory suppression, just repeating the same word over and over again,
yeah,
which almost certainly would be worse than repeating this to-be-remembered sequence over and over.
So, just without actually taking any questions off Twitter, are there any?
You got a heart.
How big an
got a
audience?
heart.
Yeah, you got a heart.
How big an audience did you get?
I fluctuated.
Well, what was the peak?
7.
7.
Yeah.
Hey! So this is Ulrich, you're first in the queue.
Some of your results, and also when I go back to this summary of the interference studies you gave in the earliest slides, reminded me of a very old-fashioned theory with Glanzer and Clark about the verbal loop. And the basic, I'm not sure whether that's the popular, where the basic idea is that whatever gets into this visual short-term store, whatever it is, it also creates some sort of verbal, it's sort of translated into a verbal code, which then is rehearsed, where you would then get the benefits of the verbal rehearsal.
Okay, so that is actually still a popular idea, I think, although I'm not familiar with the source that you raised. But, so it is I think it's uncontroversial that people will attempt to verbally recode visual information. But we do our best to make sure that that verbal code would not help them at all. Do things like, another thing that I find very interesting about that theory, and I talk with my colleagues who I disagree with about this all of the time, is if there is a verbal rehearsal loop for verbal things and a visual rehearsal loop for visual things, then why would you ever want to take visual information that should be best maintained in visual code and turn it into another code for better maintenance?
Yeah, exactly.
That's, I think, a puzzle of the multi-component working memory model that nobody has really answered very well yet. Why in the world you would have to prevent verbal recoding if you've got this rich visual system for encoding information?
More questions?
Yes.
Are you interested at all in how, like, I guess, like with language, so rather than it being like a verb?
To correct me if I'm wrong, people who are into studying language do not believe at all in the verbal rehearsal loop model. Is that more or less your impression, or?
I'm not really sure. I was just interested in, I don't know that much about that.
So it's definitely
interesting.
It's definitely the case that if you apply real linguistic materials to these memory tasks, the results sometimes change. And that is something I'm interested in, actually. If it's purely about remembering clusters of sounds in a loop that's meant to automatically extract these sounds, then you wouldn't expect for linguistic content to make the big difference that it does.
Sort of a parallel idea to the ones you talked about is the idea that covert attention shifts underlie covert attention will shortly precede it. I wonder to what extent some of the data in this area suggests that it's not necessarily that eye movements themselves have a functional role, but that they are reliable indicators of what people are doing covertly in terms of their attention shifts.
I think that that's definitely something to think about when, especially when we see the pattern of things that adults look at when the stimuli are actually on the screen. The idea that they're covertly attending to these items rather than overtly attending to these items is the most obvious way to explain why they aren't directly fixating the items that appear on the screen. And it's true, if they don't need to directly fixate the items to encode them, then you wouldn't necessarily expect some view on this, because measuring their covert attention is going to be much more difficult. But it means that we can't necessarily take literally, we're never going to get to a point where we can say, right, if they didn't look at this thing, then that means they didn't rehearse it. And so in that sense, the effects that we may expect to find are fairly small. And indeed, the effects that we find in visual array tasks, looking back at items, if they were tested on 1% better on recognition, but I've seen it as low as 4% better. And so I definitely think it's not the case that the only way to reactivate this information is to look back at this. Yes.
If you tell people to rehearse it with their eye movements, are they better at the task?
That I don't know. So I'm actually collecting some data about this right now. I don't like to actually tell them to do it.
You can instruct them in some way, or basically the idea is to manipulate it so that they do.
So certainly that's right up my alley, because there are a lot of people who do that with verbal rehearsal, of course. They say, well, this time why don't you verbally rehearse this information, or I'm going to monitor you verbally rehearsing it, make you do it out loud. But I don't like just telling them to do it. The way we're managing this is that we're showing them some sequence of items, and then during retention, it's just a way to make sure that they actually do look at least part of the sequence again. We're comparing this to just flashing up the central location, where the participants then are going to be looking at the center of the screen most of the time, and flashing up a random sequence of locations, where we've messed up any link between what their eyes are doing and the original sequence that they saw. And so far, so these data are in collection. Another reason that I'm not too sure that the eye movements are that good a proxy for rehearsal is if you don't make them, performance is better than if you do make them. So the flashing is really effective in getting them to look where we want them to look. And when they look at the central flash, their performance looks better than when they look at the consistent flash.
How does that compare to if you were to...
Just repeating the same word over and over again,
Yeah.
which almost certainly would be worse than repeating this to-be-remembered sequence over and over.
So, just without actually taking any questions off Twitter, are there any?
You got a heart.
How big an
got a
audience?
heart.
Yeah, you got a heart.
How big an audience did you get?
I fluctuated.
Well, what was the peak?
7.
7.
Yeah.
Yay. But this is just the start, people. Thanks, Candice. And if you want to talk more to her, go up to the 5th floor.